Hello, I'm Trent Watts. I live in Saskatoon and I'm a woodworker. Today I want to show you how I go about making a salt cellar box with a flip lid. This is going to be the blank. It's square now, but we will leave one corner and then we will cut on the bandsaw around, and I will show you how I mount it and how I use this one square corner that is left for the hinge for the lid of the box. We'll go to the bandsaw now. Okay, so now we have cut the three edges off and we've left this one where the hinge is going to be. It had a little bit of wood missing from the beginning, that's why it isn't pointed, but that won't matter because the hinge is going to go right in the middle. So the next step is going to be preparing a tenon on each end so that we can mount it in the lathe, and then we will cut the top off and then I'll show you the next step. So we're off to the lathe now. Here I'm making a dovetail tenon for the top of the box. This first line marks where the top of the box will be cut off. The second line marks the end of the hinge and the beginning of the completely round portion of the bottom of the salt cellar. I'm using a deep fluted gouge here to remove that material. Now I've moved to a detail gouge just to round out that portion a little bit better. Now I'm making the tenon for the bottom of the salt cellar. And here we're going to be cutting the top of the box off. I'm using the parting tool and then we'll finish it off with a saw. So now we're mounting the chuck on the lathe and we're going to put the bottom of the box into the chuck and we'll be hollowing it out. First of all, I want to make sure that the edge is completely flat because that makes it so much easier to fit the lid properly. Here I'm using a straight edge to check if the line across the face of the box is straight. And now we're starting to hollow out the inside of the box. There are a lot of different ways that you can hollow out the inside of an end grain box. Many people use a Forstner bit to begin the process. In my case, I've just used the deep fluted gouge to remove the bulk of the wood. I've now moved to a scraper to finish off the form on the bottom and to smooth off the sides. Here I'm using the scraper with the lathe stopped just to remove the little nubbin at the very bottom. My friend Elio made this tool for finishing off the bottom of a lidded box. It has a nice corner so that you can get just the shape you want right at the very bottom of the box. Now here you can see, using the bottom tool, it's basically a scraper, but you can sharpen it so you get a nice burr, and you can actually do a nice job on getting rid of some of the lines that are left on the side from the deep fluted gouge. There's a small area of grain that's torn right at the very bottom. Sorry, my head is in the way, it's hard to see. I'm using the tip of the tool to try and just remove that little white line so that I have a way less sanding to do at the end. Now it's time to sand the inside of the box. I find a stick with some Velcro attached, and then using Velcro backed sandpaper I can get what I need for sanding the inside. Sometimes I use it with the lathe turning, but ultimately each time I change grits I want to stop the lathe and then use the sandpaper in the direction of the grain to help get a better finish. I'm starting with 100 grit paper, you can see here, and then I will change to 120, move up all the way through to probably 220 before I'm all finished. This clip just shows an example of how you can turn the lathe by hand but move the sandpaper so that you can get rid of some of the circular scratches from the previous grit. So doing this in between each grit can really help. Okay, now we're going to take the top and we're going to mount it into the chuck, and then we're going to finish off the inside. We'll smooth that out, and then we'll make sure that we have the top very flat. So now I'm using the straight edge just to make sure that that surface is completely flat. That will make the lid fit a lot easier. Okay, now we're just going to finish off the inside of the lid. I'm going to make a little bit of an indent so that we can do some chatter work later on. At this point I'm just using the deep fluted gouge to make a nice smooth transition from the flat edge to a dimpled inside. Now I'm going to put a little bit of a burr on a scraper so that I can finish that off, and then we'll get ready to do some chatter work. So now I get my chatter tool ready. Turn the lathe up to quite a high speed, put it at a 45-degree angle. You can see that right here, and then just sit down to the bottom, and then we'll see what we get. The birch didn't chatter quite as well as maple, and so I'm going to put some beads in there just at the center where the grain was a little bit more torn, and it will still make a nice pattern but give a slightly different look than the chatter work did. Okay, the top is now finished, so we're going to take it out of the chuck and we'll go over to the drill press where we can drill the hole that will be used for the hinge. So now we have the bottom of the salt cellar and the top of the salt cellar. We're going to drill a hole through both of these so that we can put a pin in to act as a swivel point for the top. So now I need to know where to make that hole. If I measure here, we have a 1/2 inch of solid wood, so I'm going to come in on the top 1/4 inch and then make a mark with an awl. So now we have the center point and we're getting ready to drill the hole. Before I drill, I want to put some tape around the top and the bottom to hold them in place so they don't move during the drilling. I've set the depth gauge so that it won't go too deep. I'm going to use an 1/8 inch brass rod, so I'm using an 1/8 inch drill. Okay, so now we have the piece back on the lathe, mounted between centers. I'm just going to move the tailstock up and put a little pressure on there so it doesn't move. Now we're going to put some tape on so that the top stays in place, and then we can finish off the top part of the top of the box. Okay, that's in place. Now I'll move the tool rest, get it set. Get it just where we want it, and we'll move the piece by hand to make sure it doesn't hit anything. Then we'll use the detail gouge to finish off the top. Okay, I want to put a new burr on the shear scraper, and then I want to try and see if I can get that last bit of torn wood out so I don't end up having to sand some. Okay, that's looking better. I think we can finish off that top later on. Okay, I just want to take a little saw and get rid of that nubbin on the bottom. It's important that you don't hit the edges of the bottom, because then the saw will make a mark and you have to get that out after. Okay, now we're going to get set up so we can sand the top and the bottom. We'll show you that process now. Something that I do that is quite helpful for sanding small pieces is to put the power sanding disc in the chuck on the headstock, and then, as I'm showing here, you can hold the piece against the sandpaper. This way you can go through all of the different grits of sandpaper. In this case I'm using 100, 120, 150, probably I think I went up to 220 on this one. And so now we're pretty much finished sanding the top and the bottom, and we're going to move on to the next step. So now I'm getting ready to sand the outside. I've just squished this between centers. It is off center, but I'm not going to be turning the lathe on. It is really just a vise to hold it in position. I'm going to lock the spindle so that it can't move, and then we'll take the sander and sand around and turn it a little bit and keep readjusting it so we can smooth out all of the pieces in the lid and make them all uniform and finished. So now, with the piece firmly positioned between centers, I can use the drill and the power sanding discs to sand the piece. I can get rid of all of the rough edges and smooth things out so that all of the pieces come together. You can see here how just adjusting the spindle a little bit brings a new part of the piece into position so that you can sand them. Now that the wooden parts are finished, I want to show you how I make a brass hinge. I drill a hole in a solid piece of steel and put the brass rod in and gently tap it with a hammer to distress the top. I've cut the brass rod so that it's the appropriate length for the hole that's drilled through the top and into the bottom part of the salt cellar. Okay, we now have the pin finished, and we're going to put it in and see if we can make the lid work. Just tap it in a bit. The lid is riding smooth. All we have to do now is put a coat of finish on it, and then we'll be done. I'm going to use mineral oil and beeswax to finish this. It's a food safe product and there's likely to be food in this. So we'll just smear a bunch of mineral oil and beeswax over this, let it dry, and then we'll buff it up. Here is the finished salt cellar. Thank you so much for watching.